Welcome to the Fire and Earth podcast with your hosts, Jason Mefford and Kathy Groover. Fire and Earth, giving you the keys to unlock your limitless potential.
Welcome to another edition of the Fire and Earth podcast. I'm your co-host, Jason Mefford.
And I'm Kathy Groover, and we are excited to introduce another phenomenal guest who I had the privilege of being on his podcast, which is what we're going to talk about today, is Brad Dalius. Woo! Brad, let's go.
What's up, guys? Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, we're so excited to have you. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into what you're doing now, and then we'll have a little chat with you.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I've been doing a lot of on-air personality work the last 10 years. I've been interviewing people out in Los Angeles. I most recently had a sports talk show. I interviewed a whole bunch of people out in LA, sports athletes, celebrities, you name it. I've done podcasts in the past as well, in which I've kind of delved into more entertainment stuff. I've worked on red carpets, and really it's hard to believe, but I have been interviewing people for the past 10 years. And it's been great opportunity to work with small companies, some larger companies as well across the country. And most recently, my new project is Motivators in Motion, a brand new podcast, which I'm starting. And really, I'm looking to just motivate people a little bit. I found people need a little bit of daily inspiration. And I've kind of combined the things I've done in the past with sports people, entertainment folks, authors, speakers, you name it. And I've really put it all together in this new project with this podcast, Motivators in Motion. So I'm super excited about it. Podcasting is huge right now. I know we're going to get into that here in just a little bit, but it's definitely an exciting time, and to be able to really have people on to interview folks. Everyone's got a fascinating story to tell, right? Everyone comes from a different type of walk of life and background, and everyone has something to share. And I really love to be able to get those stories out there on my platform. And yeah, like I said, we're just beginning. We had a great first week here of the launch of the podcast, and really excited to continue to motivate and inspire a whole bunch of new people here to come.
That's so awesome. So awesome. Why do you think podcasting is so big? I mean, I have so many clients that are like, I've been listening to this podcast. I mean, that's like what everybody does now. Is it just that thirst for knowledge, or do you think this is a fad that's going to fade away like so many other things?
No, I definitely think it's here to stay. I don't think there's any question about it. I read an article recently in Time in which this past year, podcasting is over $400 million as an industry, bringing in revenue-wise. And they project by 2021, in just a couple of years, it's going to be $1 billion industry. So I think it's definitely here to stay. It's interesting because trying to reach different people on my traditional radio show, I was on traditional terrestrial AM radio out in Los Angeles, and we reach a large audience, obviously, a couple 100,000 people in the area. But I found it's very difficult to have a traditional Monday through Friday radio show and also then upload it to a podcast form and still get that traction. It's just different because you have different audiences, more of an older audience listening to regular radio, a younger audience really consuming podcasts on a regular basis. So it's definitely not going anywhere. It's here to stay. And there's so many different options. I think the thing that people love about it is it's so personal. I had this discussion with someone the other day, just riding in an Uber, and someone had on just regular radio, just regular music on a local station. I was like, when was the last time you actually saw someone playing a podcast in an Uber with a whole car full of people? And not yet, right? Most likely not, because it's so personal and people like that one-on-one connection with the host or the different guests they have on the show, or maybe the producer that comes on the show, whatever it is, people like that personal touch. And it's interesting too. There seems to be a notion of people listen to a podcast on the go when they're going to work, when they're going on a jog or a run. And that's true. A lot of people are, but the majority of people are actually listening to a podcast in their home, when they're doing their laundry, when they're cooking, when they're just doing any type of daily chores to kind of get around their house. And that's really interesting because, again, I think it falls more into just the personal category, and really just that comfort feel as well. It brings a lot of people back to maybe a certain point in their life in which they can it's kind of tied together with more of the new age as ways, as far as the podcast being presented. But I think people just find a way to connect it to their lives, and because it's so personal, and because there's so many options, people just can't get enough. There's so much to it. So it's definitely exciting. And the amazing thing is Anybody can do a podcast. Anybody can listen to a podcast. Anybody
Clearly.
Clearly what we're doing right here, right?
Anybody can do it.
And it's right there. The resources are unlimited for everybody. It's just a matter of if you want to start a podcast, are you willing to put in the work? And I think about that, and I think about so many businesses out there who haven't even scratched the surface of a podcast as far as maybe having their own podcast for their business. I truly believe that every business should have a podcast, whether or not the owner of the company or some of the workers are hosting it, or whether they basically farm it out to a third party organization to host a podcast for them. Really, the business has a chance to just reach a whole nother level and a whole nother market of people by starting a podcast. So on all fronts, it's winning right now.
Well, and it's funny because, because you had a background in terrestrial radio, you said, right?
Yes.
And are now switching to this because I see this, people are just we're getting conditioned to be able to consume entertainment when we want to get entertainment, right? So, it used to be, when we grew up, it was like 7:00 on Thursday night, you had to watch fill in the blank, right?
Sure.
Or I'm driving to work in the morning and I'm going to listen to Joe and Sally's morning show on AM, whatever, right? But you could only get it at that time. Right. And now we've really kind of switched. Everything is streaming. I think I was reading recently that streaming now has surpassed like some of the other things for traditional shows and other stuff like that, because as consumers, we want to get that content that we want when we want it. A podcast allows you to do that, right? Because like you said, whether you're folding your laundry at home and it's 8:00 at night, or if you're doing your run at 5:30 or 6 in the morning, you can tap into that, which I think is great. And I love how you brought up about the whole, kind of like personal nature of it. As people are thinking or, trying to come up with, because like you said, every business should have a podcast. What kind of things do people need to do to make it personal so that somebody else is actually going to want to listen to it?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. It comes down to what's the business about, right? What is the business? What are they trying to sell? How are they trying to reach more customers? And this is the audience you're going to reach into. There's so many millennials who are reaching that audience of people who are younger, obviously. And I believe that it can definitely be tied into a little bit of an older audience as well, because there's people of all ages who are listening to podcasts. The majority of people obviously are a little bit younger, but you still have the potential to reach some older folks as well. I think it just comes down to, just like anything else in a saturated type of industry or market, how do you stand out, so to say? You got to kind of find your niche because, if let's say a clothing company wants to start a podcast, well, there could be, 10 or 20 more podcasts just like that out there. How do you uniquely stand out? And I think that's something that I really took into creating Motivators in Motion. I wanted to find something that would really stand out. I'm a huge sports guy. I love sports. I like entertainment as well. I have a lot of different interests. And like I said, I had done a sports show out in Los Angeles, and it was great. We reached a lot of people on radio, but I just felt like we weren't really standing out per se. We were doing a lot of similar things that other people were doing. Of course, we were able to find some areas in which we stood out, which was great. It was successful. We had a lot of fun with it. But again, I really wanted to find a way to really reach more people and inspire more people in a more personal way, like podcasts can. And that's where I came up with the show in which we provide motivation on a daily basis with daily podcast interviews Monday through Friday. And it's something that not too many people are doing. So I think that's the thing. You really have to think outside of the box. And we really live in a day and age where an entrepreneurial mindset is, I think, relevant in so many different things as far as if you want to stand out. We all know the traditional 9-to-5 working is more of a thing of the past now. And it's not so much and that way. And to be able to stand out, whatever it is you do, you have to think outside the box. And I think that's where an entrepreneurial spirit comes into play. And we see that more than ever. And it's only going to continue to grow down that path, I think. But yeah, as far as businesses starting their own podcast, they really have to say, okay, how can we make this different? And this is something that I plan to really get into more as I dive more into this podcast, my own podcast over the next couple of months, is really providing a platform or a service or a resource. I'm still in the really the formation phases right now, trying to put that together. But I believe there is definitely a good resource could be available pretty soon for different businesses to start a podcast. So to be determined, more to come on that one still. But I think that's something that we could see coming pretty soon over the next couple of years. It only makes sense for businesses to continue to evolve, especially different businesses who are more so mom and pop locally, but maybe they have, a younger clientele per se, depending on if families have come in there over generations and now, the kids are coming in, the kids are getting older. There's a lot of potential for it. But again, it all comes back to thinking outside the box and really saying, how can I stand out? How can I be creative? I think a lot of times, and Kathy, we talked about this a little bit when you came on the podcast here recently, about how people just kind of get overwhelmed by things in life because there's so much, there's so many different options and they don't know where to start. And that's something that I think I've been able to kind of get. It took me a while to get to that point, but I think I've gotten to the point of, okay, I know how to kind of focus on certain different things here and just starting to, carve my path ahead to be able to put my work out there and be able to stand out. So it's just a matter of getting going sometimes and really being able to start that engine.
Well, and I was going to say, so if somebody wants to do a podcast, I mean, Jason and I talked about this for ages. We decided to pair up. We decided we were going to do the co-host thing. And then here we are. And what's great about us as a partnership is we hold each other accountable. There are days I'm sure that if it was just me, I'd be like, I'm too tired. I might get this one piece of hair that always sticks out. I'm not going to do the podcast today. But we know we're going to be here for each other. So if somebody wants to start a podcast, what is the first step for them? I mean, we just sort of dove in and it was trial by fire. But you're the expert on this. So what is the first step if somebody wants to get started on a podcast?
Yeah, it's a great question. Research. That's really the name of the game when you first start out. I think the very first thing is you got to think about who's going to be your one perfect listener. We hear a lot of talk about like creating your own persona or avatar. And it's so true. Putting together, a little like, T-chart sort of say, and writing out, different, different things that you really like, your likes and your passions, and trying to find out, who might be a good target for that, sort of say. And you have to, once you create your avatar and you really have a sense of who that one perfect listener is going to be, that's going to really drive a lot of you creating your podcast and knowing, okay, I want to pick this subject area, or I want to interview these particular type of guests because I know that my avatar is really going to need that type of inspiration, or they might find that really interesting. You have to kind of think along those terms. And I think that's definitely a part of it. And once you have your avatar set for whatever type of content you think you want to start, then you have to kind of move on to, okay, what kind of show name do I want to put out there? What do I want to talk about? And with podcasts, I'm a firm believer in keeping it simple. There's something really unique to just really simple titles, simple areas of subjects that people can relate to, not trying to recreate the wheel, sort of say, something that's far out in space that people can't really relate to yet. We're all really ambitious, but I think with podcasts, sometimes ambition is good, but keep names simple. Keep things that people know about, sort of say, but they want to, it's something that they can dive into as a listener that is a little bit more than what they know about. They might know about a certain subject, but a certain podcast can take it to another level if the research is done right. So, you got to come up with a unique name. And, I've come up with a bunch of names in the past with different shows I've done, radio and podcasts that, to be honest, were just too generic. And I wasn't able to reach a large enough audience. And, if it's just something really simple, the Joe Smith Show, I mean, that's great. You're putting your name out there. But if you're just kind of starting up as a podcaster, people don't know. They're like, okay, Joe Smith, but what's that about? What is this podcast about? We're busy, right? We're consuming media on a regular basis, really, really quick. Or as you had mentioned before, Jason, we're taking a look at different things when it's most convenient for us, not when the rest of the world wants to present it to us, sort of say. It's on our own terms. I think everyone wants to live their life on their own terms at this stage of the game here in 2019. So, which is great. And, people should be able to choose their own content as they see fit. And obviously it's up to the creators, the storytellers of the podcast, to put that stuff out there, because you're really a storyteller. You're creating a story for everyone out there. And it just comes with a lot of research in the beginning. And I really also recommend to people, you know, when you're trying to build that audience organically initially, join Facebook groups. There's so many different Facebook groups out there, or like a meetup group as well, in which you could possibly meet in person or chat online. Those are the type of areas in which, if you join those groups and you start, I would say, you know, start posting just maybe once every day. Start posting or comment on someone else's post, or maybe like something. You start doing that on a regular basis, other people in the group are going to become familiar with your activity, and there's going to be more of a trust factor, sort of say. They're going to become familiar with you and comfortable with you. And, you know, at some point, if you were able to, you know, see a question in one of those threads on Facebook or whatever it may be. And so, you know, for me, for example, talking about motivation or inspiration, if someone has a question about something, or they're not sure, and they're like, how do I get motivated about X, Y, and Z? And then I can see it. And I'm like, hey, by the way, if you kind of just do this, I found out recently that Kathy Groover mentioned on my Motivators in Motion podcast that if you do this, you can help to be, you know, a little bit better in this area of your life. And you can kind of direct them to some of your work that you've done. So it's little things like that in the beginning to really kind of gain a little bit of traction with different people, and, you know, seeing what works and what doesn't work. It's a lot of trial and error in the beginning, especially if you're brand new. I mean, you've never done anything in the past with podcasts or just media in general. Polls, getting different data out there, trying to collect it and find out what people like, what people don't like. Again, though, trying to hone in on a specific area. If you like entertainment, that's great. Ask yourself, what can I do that's a little bit different that people aren't doing? The same thing with sports, health, you name it. That's really the name of the game, because again, and it's going to be like this in so many different things. You know, we live in an ultra competitive world. It's only going to get more competitive. People are trying to find different ways to stand out from the crowd. You got to be unique. You got to really dig down deep and find that area that could really be unique and something that something isn't doing. Or if people are doing it and they're not doing it that great, say to yourself, okay, how can I do it even better?
Yeah. Well, because I think that unique part is a really important part, because, you know, whether you're doing it for business or just kind of personal because of, you know, what you like to do, I think a lot of times people are afraid to niche down, right? They want to create something that everybody, you know, I'm going to have millions of people watching me all the time, listening to me all the time. And it's like, well, but if you try to do that, then you're trying to serve too many people. You're not being unique for yourself, right? Because again, even though, you know, there's a bajillion different podcasts out there about sports or motivation or potential or success. So what is it that you do different, and who is it that you actually want to serve? I think is great. You know, I love how you talk about, you know, kind of, some people call them the avatar. Yes. And when you were talking, I remember, because I grew up on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Love Fred Rogers. Okay. And I remember one time somebody was asking him, you know, because I mean, this guy was on camera doing a daily show for, I mean, decades.
Yeah.
Right?
It's crazy.
And they're like, how do you do this? You know, how do you do this in front of the camera? And he's like, when I sit there and I look at the camera, I see a face on the other side of it that I'm talking to. And I'm just talking to one person. And so, you know, it's kind of the same way here. We shouldn't be afraid to niche down, and like you said, create content based on what you think you're unique, your unique perspective, and for someone that's fairly niched down, because there's way more of those people out there than we realize. Because that's one thing that just fascinates me about people, is it's like there are these subcultures everywhere.
Yes. Of everything.
Everywhere. Of everything. And so it's like, I mean, if you really want people to love you and follow you, be uniquely you, go after that. I mean, if it's some obscure subgroup, go for it, because there's a lot more people in that subgroup than you realize.
For sure. It's a great point there that you bring up. And another study I had read recently talked about different countries that consume podcasts the most. And it's not the United States, actually. It's actually South Korea. South Korea happens to consume the most podcasts at the moment, which is really interesting. Yeah, right.
Is that on a per capita basis or total number?
I believe they did a total number in general.
Wow.
And
Wow, that's weird.
yeah, it is. It's really interesting, right? And I got to do a little bit more research into it and how they kind of came up with that. But yeah, it's fascinating. And, going on the other end of the spectrum, the country who's listening to podcasts the least right now is the United Kingdom. And you talk about different subgroups and, different things, maybe that's interesting that people might find unique about Britain, the royal family, the UK in general. That type of a thing, thinking along those lines of tapping into that type of a market, for example, for a podcast might be interesting, might be unique.
Oh yeah.
That's definitely the way to go about it of thinking. And look, I think we all have those passions, and it's really hard sometimes for people to kind of move away from, they want to do what they truly love. And it's hard for them to kind of break away and to go into something that might be interesting for the majority of other people because it stands out. It's hard for people to have that break sometimes and to go into that different direction and to pivot. But again, if you can kind of combine different things, a lot of research, a lot of time, a lot of burning the midnight oil, but that's the type of work ethic it takes. For me, I just love it because it's so challenging being a podcaster. It challenges you on so many fronts, and it's obviously a tremendous amount of work that goes into it. And, you can do it full time. You can do it part time. You can do it for fun. I know some people who just do it because they just love it and they just do it just for a good time. And really, it works for all the above. But there's not too many things that you can say that about, sort of say. I think that you can kind of do it leisurely. You can do it. It just depends on you, what you get into it. You'll definitely, what you put into it, you'll definitely get out of it, I think. And that's kind of it in a nutshell right now.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I was at a conference and they were talking about doing Facebook Live and using Facebook Live. And there were so many people that were terrified to turn on their phone and get on Facebook Live. My hair's bad today. I don't like talking to people. I mean, there were all these fears, and it was specifically the women that felt like they needed to be camera ready and perfect. And if you've ever seen my daily pause, there are days I'm at a dance class, I'm out of the shower, I'm like a mess, just like turning on the phone because I have a message at that moment. You want to be a little slightly probably more groomed with a podcast, as I do try to brush my hair in the morning. But what are some of the big mistakes that you see people making when they start podcasts? Do you think they're trying to make it too perfect? Do you think they're too casual? I mean, like, what are some of the big errors that you've seen people like just really screw up doing their podcasts?
For one, if you're thinking about doing an interview-based podcast, kind of like the one I'm doing now with Motivators in Motion, and this is a mistake I made in the past, and I really have tried to correct it going forward and tried to really help other people do that as well. Not really utilizing your guest that much. I think there tends to be a sense of, okay, you have a guest on a podcast and the interview comes out, it's great. And that's kind of it then. There's not a whole lot of, going back and forth and, doing what we're doing here. Someone comes on one person's podcast and then, returning the favor, sort of say, and, being exposed to new audiences. I think that's the cool thing. When you go on someone's podcast, obviously you're being exposed to one audience. And then if you go on your guest podcast, sort of say, it's a whole new audience that you're going to come across. Even if it's an audience that might be very similar to yours, who's listening to your podcast, it doesn't matter. Any exposure is good exposure to new folks. And I think that's one thing that people just don't do as much, or they're not sure how to go about it, sort of say. But utilizing your guests, I can't stress that one enough, is huge, especially when you're just starting out, when you're trying to build organically. And that's going to be a big area in which you're going to get those folks. And just sending out emails reminding folks that the interview's coming out today, making it very easy for them to access the interview and be able to share it via social media. I think that's huge. And really just having all your ducks in a row. It's a lot of T's crossed, I's dotted, sort of say, when you're having guests on and when you're putting out episodes, and just so many different things. And even when you're putting tags into your personal audio episodes of the audio itself and tagging it with your podcast name, the author, yourself, obviously, and the category, the year it was released, all those different things matter so much to help build up your SEO. And those are the things that I know I didn't think about when I first started doing podcasts 5-6 years ago. Definitely not something I did when I was doing a radio show. But it's something that really helps a lot. It's a lot of little things. sort of say, with a podcast and doing that. But again, I can't stress enough utilizing your guest. And, after the guests have shared an episode and the days passed, follow your guest on Twitter, Facebook, connect with them on LinkedIn and like a lot of different things that they're doing. And, outside of your own podcast, I think that really helps to build a rapport. And again, it's being able to be exposed to more of an audience, and, that guest audience will see you interacting, and, they'll like that. They'll like that because a lot of times hosts will just, they'll go on to the next guest and they'll kind of forget, sort of say, or they're just so consumed with everything that the podcast has to do with that they just they tend to kind of neglect it a little bit, and not on purpose, sometimes just by accident. But it's things like that you can really pay close attention to, that'll really help to build up that audience and really get more listeners. It'll boost you up in Apple Podcasts to kind of, especially if you're new, it'll get you like in that new and a noteworthy section in the first 10 or so listed on the main page for Apple Podcasts, different things like that. Again, it's not something that people usually talk about too much, but it definitely can make a big difference.
Yeah.
Well, I know even in my personal podcast library, probably 75% of the ones that I've subscribed to, I learned about from another podcast that I was listening to.
Yeah.
So like later today, Motivators in Motion is going to end up in my library, right?
I love it.
A new subscriber today. Awesome. And I've seen that, and it really is. It becomes like this viral kind of thing, right? Is because, again, if you're listening to somebody consistently, you like what they're saying, they make reference to something else, a book, a podcast, somebody else, there's a very, very good chance that those people are going to go out and actually do whatever. In fact, I think it's, I know a lot of online entrepreneurs, and one lady in particular, she chose to go all in on her podcast this last year. And she did nothing different in her business except actually advertising her podcast, trying to grow her following in her podcast. But each time she's launched, like the last 4 launches, she's doubled her launch each time. Not by trying to do ads on the product or anything else, but simply by using the podcast strategy, getting more followers herself, going on other people's podcasts, advertising about her free podcast, right? So she's advertising for something that she's not earning money on, and it gets that trust with people. And so now when she mentions stuff, and you can see this too. I mean, you're talking about what, $400 million business that we think is going to go to $1 billion.
Yep.
How much do people charge for podcasts? Zero usually, right? So this all is coming in sponsor money and everything else. And you can see that when people have that almost kind of celebrity following, then they start adding in, some of these other things. Because again, if you trust somebody, hey, Brad, I love what you do, man. I've been following you for a year. And then Brad goes, hey, by the way, why don't you buy this new deodorant? I've been using it and it's great. I kid you not. There was a deodorant commercial on a podcast I listened to the other day.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's like, you'd be like, what the, and it's like, but it's almost going back. So if you think about this, right, because you were terrestrial radio before. Yeah. Everything comes in cycles. Yeah. So think about terrestrial radio in the 30s and 40s, right? Little Orphan Annie brought to you by Malto Mill or whatever, right? Sure. That's going to be happening again. And again, it goes back to the whole idea of if you have a following, if people trust you, if people like you, that's where, again, we're going to see more and more of that kind of stuff going there. So it's just fascinating for me to kind of watch from the outside and the inside. Yeah. Right. And it's like, Brad, I mean, you're doing that too. You're like, dude, when you said you're doing 5 episodes a week, I'm like, holy crap, man, you're busy. I know what it's like to just do a weekly one, right?
Right, I know.
Weekly ones, it's like, man, that's a lot of content. That's a lot of work. But it's where people are going.
For sure.
We got to be there.
So once again, we've blown through our half hour of time.
No.
No, we did. We have to say goodbye. Brad, any final thoughts, any tips for people? And then let's find out how our listeners and viewers can find you, can find the podcast that you're doing and my episode too, and all that good stuff. So any final thoughts, and then how can we find you?
Totally. Yeah. I think a lot of times people who've never done podcasting before in the past, like I kind of mentioned earlier, who have no background in any type of broadcasting or communications, are just really scared sometimes and nervous about starting a podcast. But like I said, anybody can do it. You're not going to be Pat Summerall, John Madden, some of the all-time greats, announcers, Walter Cronkite. You're not going to be those type of people when you first start out with a podcast. Give it time, take it day by day. If you're passionate, if you believe in what you're doing, and if you're committed to putting good quality content out there, it'll come. It'll definitely come. The listeners will come. Just don't think you have to be someone who you're not. Just be yourself. That's the biggest thing, because I've been a firm believer in not really comparing yourself to other people. We can definitely aspire to be other people. We can take, little snippets of other people and try and incorporate it into maybe our work ethic to be better at that particular craft. But don't compare yourself too much to people, because there's so much talent out there. And the really cool thing is there's only one of you. There's only one of you. No one's going to be able to duplicate exactly what you're doing if you're willing to really put in the time to put good stuff out there. So that's kind of my lasting thing is don't be afraid to do it just because you don't have a dynamite golden voice, or you weren't trained to do that or study that type of stuff in college. Anybody can do it.
Cool. Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's why I said just go. It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to be camera ready 24/7. Fabulous. All right, Brad, you've been great. I love, and since Jason and I are sort of newer to the podcasting thing, this is a great conversation. How can our viewers and listeners find you and your podcast and get more info?
Yeah, of course. You can go to motivatorsinmotion.com. That's my main site. All the podcast episodes are listed there. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, and Spotify as well, Stitcher Radio, you name it. Best place to go, though, is the website, and you can sign up for our newsletter there. I'll get you hooked up with everything so that you're not missing any episodes, just like Kathy's episode that she did here recently on the podcast. That's listed as well at motivatorsinmotion.com in the podcast section. So check it out. Again, my goal for everyone is, I hope, if not a daily occurrence for people, I hope I can at least become a part of people's weekly podcast listening and provide a little bit more motivation, a little inspiration, and that's a really unique thing, is that people are always looking for it. People who maybe have really focused on their careers and they're killing it right now with their jobs. That's awesome. But maybe they need a little inspiration with, how do I balance relationships or hobbies? We got that covered for you. Motivatorsinmotion.com.
Oh, that's great. Yay. You've been fabulous. All right. This has been the Fire and Earth podcast. We'll see you on another edition. I'm Kathy Groover, and I can be reached at kathygruver.com.
And I'm Jason Mefford. I can be reached at jasonmefford.com. So if you want to do it, just go out and do it. It ain't going to be perfect to begin with, but you'll start unlocking your potential the more you do it. It'll get easier. And wow, the sky is the limit. We'll see you on the next episode of the Fire and Earth podcast.
See ya.
See ya.